also yesterday as SpaceX and NASA resumed preparations for this crew launch after suspending work here at the Florida spaceport for a few days last week due to Hurricane Ian. But with no damage to any of the flight hardware or ground facilities out at Pad 39A, teams have pad from SpaceX's hangar yesterday lifted vertical on Pad 39A. And right now, SpaceX's launch team is preparing for a test firing of the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage booster. Right now, we think that test firing is scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 8 p.m. or 2000 UTC. So about 35 minutes away. If that remains on track, we expect to see SpaceX begin loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket right about now at T-minus 35 minutes. SpaceX does not provide any media access or updates on the progress of its test firings and static fire tests, so we'll be watching for cues out at Pad 39A, particularly the start of venting and any vapors that appear around the vehicle and around the strong back from the beginning of loading of super cold liquid oxygen into the vehicle. That's a good indication that the test firing will remain on track for 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, this is a test firing of the Falcon 9 rocket for the Crew 5 launch, which is scheduled for Wednesday, 3 days from today. That launch on Wednesday will begin a planned 5-month expedition on the International Space Station for a 4-person crew. That crew is led by NASA astronaut Nicole Mann. The pilot on this mission is Josh Cassada, also a NASA astronaut. The other 2 crew members are Koichi Wakata from the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency and Anna Kikina, a Roscosmos cosmonaut, a Russian cosmonaut, who will become the first Russian crew member to fly on a U.S. crew capsule, U.S. commercial crew capsule, under a new so-called seat swap agreement that NASA signed with the Russian Space Agency earlier this year. That will enable Russian crew members to fly on Crew Dragon spacecraft to the space station, and also enables NASA or U.S. astronauts to fly on Russian Soyuz flights up to the space station, and gives each major partner on the ISS program 2 avenues to have their crews reach the space station in the event of any major problems, either with the U.S. vehicles or the Russian vehicles. So right now we're about 33 minutes away from the expected ignition time for this test firing. The 9 Merlin 1D engines will be lit for about 7 seconds or so, while hold down clamps remain closed out at the pad to keep the Falcon 9 rocket firmly on the pad, on the ground, so no launch will be occurring today. There was also no crew members on board the Dragon spacecraft for this test, so the pad is completely evacuated in advance of this static fire test. We expect to be occurring here at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll stand by for visual cues in the next couple of minutes to confirm that tanking has started, and that will give us a good indication that the static fire remains on track for 4 p.m. Again, if you're just joining us, you're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We're just awaiting a visual confirmation of the start of propellant loading, which should have begun 9 minutes ago if this static fire test was on schedule for 4 p.m. Eastern Time, which is the opening of today's static fire window, 4 p.m. Eastern, 2000 or 8 p.m. UTC. So we're going to stand by and continue watching these live views of pad 39A, waiting for the start of vapors and venting around the launch complex to confirm that propellant loading has started. We believe we do now see some vapors around the Falcon 9 booster. This is from the loading of super cold cryogenic liquid oxygen, chilled several hundred degrees below zero. That oxygen boils off to become a vapor in the warm Florida atmosphere here at Kennedy Space Center. And those vapor plumes are now visible around the circumference of the Falcon 9 booster stage. So this does indicate that propellant loading is now underway. And we believe the static fire test remains on schedule for 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. UTC. We'll get another signal of confirmation of that timetable in a few minutes. We should see the big vent from the strongback near the top of the Falcon 9, near the upper stage or interstage area. That'll be a plume of gaseous oxygen that will appear from a vent on the strongback, and that always occurs at around T-minus 20 minutes. So we expect to see that in less than 3 minutes. If we do see that at 3:40 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll know for sure that the static fire is right on schedule for 4 p.m. Eastern Time or 8 p.m. UTC. We are seeing that big vent from the Strongback now. Just a little more than 20 minutes to go now until the static fire test for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on Launch Complex 39A. Everything looks to be on schedule for 4 p.m. ignition time for this test firing. Again, the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage booster will be ignited for around 7 seconds, while hold down restraints keep the Falcon 9 firmly on the ground. This static fire test is a customary part of all SpaceX crew launch campaigns. SpaceX has moved away from conducting static fires on most of the company's other launches, but these remain a milestone on every crew launch campaign for now. And again, this rocket you're watching now on Pad 39A is scheduled to launch on Wednesday with the Crew 5 mission under contract with NASA, with 2 NASA astronauts, 1 Japanese astronaut, and 1 Russian cosmonaut on board. That crew is not currently on the Dragon spacecraft, so there's no one out at the pad this afternoon for this static fire test, now 19 minutes away. Continuing to watch that vent from the Strongback of gaseous oxygen streaming away from the Strongback area. That Strongback is the structure or mast that is flush up against the Falcon 9 rocket vertically out at Pad 39A. That's the structure that also lifts the Falcon 9 vertical on the pad before each launch. And the venting you're seeing right now is part of a purge or a milestone in the countdown that actually chills down the liquid oxygen transfer lines that lead up the Strongback. These are the lines that liquid oxygen flow through before loading of this super cold oxidizer onto the second stage. So the fueling process begins with loading liquid oxygen and kerosene into the first stage at T-minus 35 minutes. That's followed by the start of loading of kerosene also into the second stage, also at T-minus 35 minutes. And that's followed at T-minus 16 minutes by liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage. That's the final propellant tank to be filled during the countdown. And SpaceX is following much of the same procedures for this static fire test during this final 35-minute countdown sequence as they would on launch day. So in about a minute and a half or so, liquid oxygen should start flowing into the second stage of the Falcon 9. And what you're seeing now is the conditioning of the loading lines before that loading actually begins. The Falcon 9 and Dragon spacecraft out on Pad 39A stand 215 feet, or about 65 meters in height. And in preparation for this static fire test, about 30 minutes ago, we saw the crew access arm retract from the Dragon spacecraft. That's the white arm that is covering the very top of the Dragon spacecraft right now out on Pad 39A. This view, you also get a good look at other parts of the pad. On the left of the black fixed service structure is the water tower that will flow water onto the launch pad deck during the final seconds of the countdown for acoustical energy suppression. You can also, if you look closely, you can see the slide wire baskets at the very top of the fixed service structure. Those slide wires would be used by the astronauts if they needed to evacuate the pad quickly due to an emergency in the final minutes of the countdown. Actually, those slide wire baskets will be used during an emergency earlier in the countdown, because once the final 35 minutes of the countdown are underway with propellant loading started, the launch escape system is armed on the Crew Dragon spacecraft. So any major potentially deadly emergency out at the pad in the final 35 minutes of the countdown would be addressed by activating that escape system to propel the Crew Dragon spacecraft away from the rocket. But the slide wire baskets are at the top of the fixed service structure, and if needed, they would be used to whisk the astronauts away down slide wires to a bunker on the west side of the pad. With less than 16 minutes remaining in the countdown until the static fire test, liquid oxygen loading should now be underway on the second stage. So all 4 propellant tanks should now be undergoing loading actually 3 of the propellant tanks should actually be undergoing loading at this time. The kerosene tank on stage 2 should be full. So right now, liquid oxygen and kerosene should be flowing into stage 1, and liquid oxygen should be flowing into stage 2. 15 minutes to go until this static fire test for the Crew 5 mission. Now approaching T-minus 12 minutes. T-minus 12 minutes mark remaining until the static fire test for SpaceX and NASA's Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station. Again, you're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where SpaceX has a Falcon 9 rocket and Crew Dragon spacecraft vertical, and propellant loading is now well underway at Pad 39A to prepare for this test firing of the first stage engines at 4 p.m. Eastern Time or 8 p.m. UTC. Earlier today, the 4 crew members who will ride the Crew Dragon spacecraft to the space station participated in what's known as a dry dress rehearsal. The dry meaning it was not during an active countdown. There were no propellants being loaded, no liquid fuels on board during this test. The 4 crew members actually got to suit up in their SpaceX pressure suits and rode in their Tesla automobiles out to Pad 39A from crew quarters at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. They rode the elevator up the fixed service structure and actually walked across the crew access arm and climbed into their seats on board the Crew Dragon spacecraft. That rehearsal was completed before midday today, and the astronauts and the Russian cosmonaut on this mission disembarked from the Dragon spacecraft and then returned to crew quarters for a debriefing, and then to continue with their launch preparations over the next couple of days. They'll have an opportunity also to visit with their family members before their scheduled launch at noon Eastern Time, 1600 UTC on Wednesday. Now, less than 10 minutes remaining until the static fire test for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on pad 39A. The view you're seeing now comes from the Kennedy Space Center press site, less than 3.5 miles from the pad. Looking out toward the east, you can see the Falcon 9 vertical on pad 39A. Off to the right, you see some of the construction work underway for SpaceX's Starship launch site here in Florida. The launch pad gantry tower has been structurally completed. That was completed a few weeks ago. However, additional work is required to fully outfit that structure, including the addition of gantry arms, which will be added in the coming months. On the right side of this view is SpaceX's Falcon 9 hangar, which is where the Falcon 9 rocket is integrated with its payloads, in this case, the Crew Dragon spacecraft, before rolling horizontally up the ramp on the transporter erector transporter device, and then that erector actually raises the Falcon 9 vertical on the launch mount out at pad 39A. This mission set to launch Wednesday, again, is called Crew 5. It's the 5th fully operational crew rotation flight to the space station by SpaceX under a multi-billion-dollar contract that actually covers 14 operational flights in total. This is the 5th of those 14 to meet the space station's crew transportation requirements up through 2030. It'll be the 8th astronaut launch by SpaceX overall. That includes the historic Demo 2 test flight with 2 NASA astronauts on board back in May of 2020. That was a test flight, not counted among the operational missions that I was talking about a moment ago. And SpaceX has also launched 2 fully commercial private astronaut missions on the Crew Dragon vehicle. One of those was Inspiration 4, which carried a team of 4 private citizens to low Earth orbit for 3 days back in September of 2021. And then more recently, this past April, SpaceX launched the Axiom 1 mission, which was the first private astronaut mission to the space station, well, also with a crew of 4 on that flight. The spacecraft you're seeing now at the very top of the Falcon 9, partially obscured by this crew access arm in this view, unfortunately, is the Crew Dragon Endurance spacecraft. This is a spacecraft that completed its first long-duration flight to the space station earlier this year, and this reusable capsule is going for its second flight to space on the Crew 5 mission. Again, the launch is set for Wednesday from Kennedy Space Center. Below that, with the NASA worm logo in red, you can also see the NASA meatball logo in blue. Those logos are on the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Below that is the black band of the interstage adapter, which actually connects the second stage with the first stage booster. That interstage composite adapter actually encloses around the second stage engine. And below that is the solid white first stage booster. This booster assigned to the Crew 5 mission is known as Booster 1077 in SpaceX's fleet of reusable rockets. This booster is going to be making its first launch on Crew 5. So a rare first flight booster on this upcoming crew launch. If you've watched many SpaceX missions recently, you'll know that most of them have flown with reused boosters that have been recovered and flown numerous times. Up to 14 times now SpaceX has flown reusable boosters. But Booster 1077 is making its first flight ready to join SpaceX's fleet with the Crew 5 mission. Now, T-minus 5 minutes and 30 seconds at this point in the countdown. The first stage kerosene tank should be full. We should have passed that milestone a few moments ago. Liquid oxygen loading will, however, continue all the way down until about T-minus 2 minutes when the liquid oxygen loading will be secured. Now less than 5 minutes to go until the static fire test. This engine test firing for Crew 5 remains set for 4 p.m. Eastern Time or 8 p.m. UTC. The next few moments, we should see the strong back structure begin its retraction away from the Falcon 9 rocket. We may be seeing the first sign of that now with the opening of clamps at the top of that strong back from around the top of the second stage. The strong back mast will recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle, and it will remain there for the remainder of the test. Less than 4 minutes to go until the test firing of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. We're now seeing that strong back indeed retracting from the Falcon 9 rocket, indicating everything remains right on schedule. Now less than 2 minutes left until the static fire test at pad 39A. At this time, liquid oxygen loading should have concluded. So right now, the Falcon 9 is fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of propellant. Just a small fraction of that will actually be consumed during this static fire test, which again is only supposed to last about 7 seconds or so. 90 seconds until engine start for today's Crew 5 static fire test. Looking out from the KSC press site toward pad 39A, the Crew 5 mission logo visible there on the countdown clock at the press site. Now a tighter shot of the upper portion of the Falcon 9. This 215-foot, 65-meter vehicle is ready to fire up today on pad 39A for the static fire test, T-minus 60 seconds. At this point, the Falcon 9's onboard computer is taking command of the countdown. In the next few moments, the propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. That will be done by enabling the vent valves to close and activating that helium pressurant system on board the Falcon 9. T-minus 40 seconds. Again, this is a static fire test for the Crew 5 mission, SpaceX's next astronaut flight to the space station set for launch Wednesday in partnership with NASA. Less than 30 seconds to go. T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 10 seconds. We'll stand by for engine start. And there's engine start. 9 Merlin engines firing out on pad 39A for this static fire test. And we have engine cutoff. This looked to be a standard, successful static fire test, at least visually, with those engines running for approximately 7 seconds, sending the plume of exhaust out the north flame trench out at pad 39A. Everything looked good with that test. However, SpaceX engineers will spend the next few hours analyzing the data to ensure that all 9 of those engines ran well. Everything else worked perfectly for this test. And that will allow them to proceed into the launch readiness review early in the week. That will be a meeting of senior SpaceX and NASA officials to confirm all is ready to go for the launch of the Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station on Wednesday. If you're just joining us, if you've watched and enjoyed this static fire coverage, we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll get alerts when we're going live with all of our coverage, such as we did for this static fire test and also the numerous upcoming launches on Florida Space Coast. You can also become a member of our YouTube channel. We have various membership levels available for you to choose from. And depending on which tier you choose, you can gain access to exclusive bonus video features only for our Spaceflight Now members. Our Spaceflight Now members really help us continue our coverage and expand our coverage of the space program, both on our YouTube channel and on our spaceflightnow.com homepage, which has now been active for 22 years, providing coverage of space news around the world. And we want to continue to bring you this coverage in an era of ever increasing launches and launch activity. And your memberships really help us be able to do that. We're now 4 minutes on from the static fire test of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket on pad 39A. We did see what we think was a successful test firing, at least visually. However, the data review will continue for some time this afternoon and this evening to officially clear the Falcon 9 and its engines and all the other systems for launch. That will actually formally come during a launch readiness review early this week in preparation for the launch Wednesday of the Crew 5 mission to the International Space Station. If you go to our Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com, you can purchase the Crew 5 mission patch, which you see here. We have other mission patches available for you as well on our Spaceflight Now store. And the proceeds from these sales help us continue our coverage of the space program. So if you want to purchase the Crew 5 patch or any of our other products for sale, go to the Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com. With that, we'll conclude our live commentary for this static fire test. You can check our Spaceflight Now Mission Status Center on our homepage at spaceflightnow.com for further updates on the outcome of the static fire test and the preparations for launch of the Crew 5 mission. Again, that launch is scheduled for Wednesday at 12 p.m. noon Eastern Time. That's 1600 UTC. The mission will be commanded by Nicole Mann. Pilot is Josh Cassada. Both of those are NASA astronauts. Also on board are mission specialists Koichi Wakata from Japan and Anna Kikina from Russia. This crew is heading to the space station to begin a 5-month expedition. Right now, their return date is targeted for late February. They'll be replacing the Crew 4 astronauts who have been on the International Space Station since April, and they'll ride their separate Crew Dragon spacecraft back to Earth for a splashdown in the either the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Florida in mid-October. Right now, SpaceX is now draining the kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants from the Falcon 9 rocket after today's static fire test. And once those propellants are drained, the rocket will be safed and secured, and normal work will resume out at Pad 39A to prepare for Wednesday's launch. Before we sign off on this stream, we're going to continue streaming live views without commentary on our YouTube channel of Pad 39A over the next few days. So you'll continue to watch live as SpaceX prepares for this launch on Wednesday. And of course, we'll have live commentary and full coverage of the Crew 5 countdown and flight to orbit, culminating in the docking with the space station the day after launch on spaceflightnow.com. And we'll be streaming the launch as well, beginning a few hours before liftoff on our YouTube channel. So look out for that alert. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so now, and you'll get alerts when we're going live on Wednesday morning, as well as for other launches. It's a busy week ahead in the U.S. launch business. We've already seen the successful launch of Firefly's Alpha rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base on Saturday. A new member to the U.S. Commercial Launch Club now has reached orbit with that launch. And then tomorrow, we'll be covering the live rollout of ULA's Atlas V rocket at Cape Canaveral. Here's a shot of Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We'll be covering the rollout of the Atlas V to the pad tomorrow morning. The Atlas V is currently inside the vertical integration facility. That's the building with the U.S. flag on the right. It'll be making that trip out to pad 41 on the left tomorrow morning at around 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 1400 UTC. That launch, that Atlas V launch, is scheduled for Tuesday during a 45-minute launch window opening at 5:36 p.m. Eastern Time, 2136 UTC. And this commercial satellite launched by ULA will carry 2 geostationary TV broadcasting satellites into geosynchronous orbit for SES, one of the world's largest geostationary satellite operators. So 2 commercial TV broadcasting satellites on board that flight, set to lift off from the Cape on Tuesday. We've talked a lot today about Crew 5 that launches on Wednesday at noon Eastern Time, or 1600 UTC. And then on Thursday, SpaceX will be back in action with another Falcon 9 launch from Pad 40 over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This mission will carry a pair of geostationary TV broadcasting satellites into orbit for Intelsat. So 2 of the world's largest geosatellite operators in action this week with launches from the Cape, 1 launch on an Atlas V, 1 launch on a Falcon 9, both launches each carrying 2 satellites for these legacy large satellite operators. In addition to those missions, there's another SpaceX launch actually on tap for tomorrow, Monday evening, from Vandenberg Space Force Base with another batch of Starlink internet satellites. That launch is scheduled again for tomorrow evening from Vandenberg Space Force Base, Space Launch Complex 4 West. That mission will carry 52 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Liftoff is scheduled for 7:56 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, 4:56 p.m. Pacific. For those of you in other time zones, that is 23:56 UTC. We'll be covering that also live on spaceflightnow.com. We'll be streaming the launches live on YouTube, all 3 of the launches from the Cape this week. So with that, we're going to conclude our live coverage of the static fire for the Crew 5 mission. We saw that static fire apparently successful at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, a little more than 11 minutes ago. We'll be streaming continuous live views of the pad 39A, over the next few days, culminating in that Crew 5 launch on Wednesday. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live. Thanks for joining us for the static fire for Crew 5. We'll see you next time.